humming softly as she arranged sunflowers in a vase.
They were a gift from her husband, Mark, for their anniversary. 6 months into their marriage, things couldn't be better. Their laughter echoed through their cozy home, filled with the scent of baking bread and the promise of a happy future.
Look what I found. We're going to be amazing parents.
Sarah turned, her eyes shining with tears. She rested her hand on her slightly rounded belly, a secret she was bursting to share. That night, they announced the pregnancy at a dinner party with Mark's parents.
About time. I've been waiting for a grandchild.
Sarah smiled, but a flicker of unease passed through her. Richard's eyes seemed to linger on her a moment too long. Later that week, as Mark was leaving for a business trip, he held Sarah close.
2 weeks without you is going to be torture. Be good, okay?
Sarah nodded, a knot of guilt tightening in her stomach. She had something to tell him, something that threatened to shatter their perfect life. The words caught in Sarah's throat. Mark was back, his face alight with joy at being home. He'd even brought her favorite chocolates. Guilt gnawed at her. He deserved to know. That night, as they lay in bed, Sarah finally spoke, her voice barely a whisper.
Mark, there's something I need to tell you.
What is it, love?
The words hung in the air, heavy and suffocating. Mark's face drained of color. The chocolates slipped from his grasp, falling onto the floor with a dull thud.
When?
Silence descended upon them, thick with betrayal and heartbreak. Mark got up and walked to the window, his shoulders slumped. The silence stretched on, each tick of the clock a hammer blow to Sarah's heart.
Was it a one-time thing?
Sarah hesitated.
Yes.
She lied, hating herself for compounding her betrayal. Mark didn't yell, didn't rage. He simply stood there, his back to Sarah, the weight of her confession crushing him. When he finally turned, his eyes were red-rimmed but surprisingly calm.
We'll get a paternity test. It's the only way to know for sure.
Over the next few days, a heavy silence hung over the house. Mark was distant, lost in his pain. Sarah wanted to reach out, to apologize 1,000 times, but the words wouldn't come. She'd shattered their trust, their future. Despite the circumstances, Mark insisted on going to the doctor's appointment for the paternity test. He held Sarah's hand as the nurse drew the blood, his touch sending a jolt of guilt through her. He was being so understanding, so strong.
It's going to be okay.
He whispered, squeezing her hand, but Sarah could see the doubt in his eyes, the fear that the child he'd already begun to love might not be his. She prayed for a miracle, for the test to prove that their baby was his, a chance to salvage their fractured happiness. The wait for the DNA test results was agonizing. Days turned into an eternity. Mark threw himself into his work, while Sarah walked on eggshells, her guilt amplified by his quiet suffering.
She knew she didn't deserve his forgiveness, but the thought of losing him completely was unbearable.
The phone call came on a Tuesday morning. Sarah watched, her heart pounding as Mark answered. His face was unreadable as he listened to the voice on the other end.
Thank you.
He hung up slowly, his gaze meeting Sarah's. She asked, her voice barely a whisper. Mark ran a hand through his hair, his face etched with a mixture of relief and confusion.
The baby, he's not mine.
Relief washed over Sarah, followed instantly by a wave of fresh fear.
But the test showed a close genetic match. They think it might be a close relative.
Sarah's blood ran cold. A close relative? How was that possible? The only person she'd been with besides Mark was... No, it couldn't be. The very thought was too horrible to contemplate. She asked, her voice trembling. Mark sank into a chair, his face ashen. He looked utterly lost.
I don't know.
He mumbled, staring at his hands.
I need to think.
He got up and paced the room, his agitation growing.
Who was he, Sarah? Tell me who it was.
He demanded, his voice raw with pain. Sarah couldn't meet his eyes. The truth was, a venomous snake coiled in her stomach, threatening to strike.
It doesn't matter now. The baby isn't yours. It's over.
Don't you dare.
Mark roared, slamming his fist on the table.
Don't you dare try to shut me out. Tell me who he was.
Trapped, Sarah closed her eyes and whispered the name that had haunted her for weeks.
Richard.
The silence that followed was deafening. Mark stared at her, his face a mask of disbelief.
You're lying. Tell me you're lying.
He breathed, his voice shaking, but Sarah couldn't. The guilt and shame were etched on her face, confirming his worst fear. The room seemed to spin as the full weight of her confession crashed down upon them. Mark's father, his own father, was the father of her child. It was a betrayal so deep, so twisted, that it threatened to consume them both. In the aftermath, there were no words of comfort, no easy answers, just the crushing reality of a family irrevocably broken. The happy home they had built together was now tainted, the laughter replaced by a silence filled with pain and recrimination. The future they had envisioned, once bright with hope and promise, lay in ruin.